November 6th, 2001. Florence, Montana. A customer enters a salon called the Hair Gallery and discovers the bodies of 3 murdered women. The salon's 62-year-old owner, Dorothy Harris, a 44-year-old employee named Brenda Patch, and a 71-year-old customer named Cynthia Paulus. The victims have each had their throats cut, and the customer reports having seen an oddly dressed individual exiting the salon when they arrived. 6.5 years later, a pair of drug dealers named Weber and Benavides are indicted for their alleged roles in the crime, but the charges against them are eventually dropped, and no one is ever convicted of the Florence Salon Murders. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host, Robin Warder, and today we're going to be covering an odd crime in which there were 3 victims: the 2001 murders of Dorothy Harris, Brenda Patch, and Cynthia Paulus, aka the Florence Salon Murders. I've received a few requests to cover this one over the years, and would often pass by it on my list of case requests, but it wasn't until recently when I finally decided to start delving into the story, and it turned out to be a major rabbit hole. The crime took place at a salon called the Hair Gallery located in rural Montana, as someone inexplicably went in there during business hours and savagely cut the throats of 2 employees and a customer. What makes this case even more strange is that the eyewitness who found the victims' bodies would report seeing what they described as a quote-unquote oddly dressed individual exiting the salon when they arrived. This person was reportedly dressed in garb that you'd expect to find on a character from a western set in the 1800s, but after they left the scene, they just seemed to vanish without a trace. Years later, it almost appeared like there was going to be a resolution in this case, when 2 career criminals named Weber and Benavides were indicted for the murders, and the theories pushed forward by the authorities is that the crime may have been connected to a drug debt involving someone associated with at least one of the victims. However, even though many details about the case against these 2 men were kept secret from the public, it seemed apparent that the evidence was not particularly strong, so the murder charges were dropped before either of them stood trial. The door is always open to charge at least one of the suspects again should new evidence surface, but it sounds like opinions are sharply divided about whether Weber and Benavides were responsible for these murders. Indeed, the whole crime is so bizarre that it's entirely possible that the victims were attacked by a completely random stranger who just wanted to kill someone that day. Whatever the case, we're going to explore all the different scenarios on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the Florence Salon Murders. Our story begins in 2001 in Florence, Montana, a small town located in the Bitterroot Valley in Ravalli County. The town is named after Florence Hammond, wife of Andrew Benoni Hammond, who was a prominent lumber baron in the area at the turn of the 20th century, and at this particular point, their population is around 900. Shortly before 11 a.m. on Tuesday, November the 6th, a customer drove into the parking lot of the hair gallery, a hair and nail salon located off US Route 93. The customer had an appointment scheduled, but as she was arriving, she saw what she would later describe as a quote-unquote oddly dressed individual exiting out the front of the salon and walking away. This individual was described as being a slender white male who appeared to be in his 20s or early 30s and was about 6 feet tall and had narrow facial features. The most distinctive thing about this person was his attire, as he wore a wide-brimmed hat on his head, which may have been a top hat or a large fedora, and was dressed in a black, calf-length Western-style duster coat. It was common practice for people to use the salon's back door as the main entrance rather than the front door, so after she parked her car, the customer walked around to the back. When she entered the hair gallery, she was horrified to discover the salon's 62-year-old owner, Dorothy Harris, lying dead on the floor across the doorway in a pool of blood. It was apparent that Dorothy's throat had been cut, so the customer immediately used the salon's phone to call 911. The Ravalli County Sheriff's Office soon arrived at the scene, and it wasn't long before they found 2 more dead women in the salon's utility closet. 44-year-old Brenda Patch, who worked there as a manicurist, and 71-year-old Cynthia Paulus, a regular customer. Like Dorothy, both women had been murdered by having their throats cut. It was common practice for Cynthia to schedule an appointment at the salon every Friday morning, but this particular week, she decided to come in on Tuesday morning instead, because she was planning to attend a basketball game at the University of Montana later that night and wanted to look nice. The community was left absolutely shocked by the crime, and all 3 victims left behind sizable families. Dorothy lived on a ranch just outside of Florence with her husband of 46 years and had 5 grandchildren, 16 grandchildren, and 2 great-grandchildren. Cynthia lived in Florence with her husband of 10 years and left behind 4 children, 4 stepchildren, and 11 grandchildren. Brenda lived in the nearby town of Stevensville with her own husband, and they were just 5 days shy of their 24th wedding anniversary, and she also left behind 2 grown children and a 2-year-old grandson. Since the hair gallery was closed on Sundays and Mondays, Dorothy would usually run the salon's weekly deposit to a bank in Stevensville on Tuesday mornings while Brenda opened for business. Investigators were able to determine that Dorothy visited the bank at around 10:30 a.m., and since it took approximately 15 to 20 minutes for her to drive back to the salon, she was likely killed almost immediately after she arrived. In fact, Brenda and Cynthia may have already been dead by that point, or Dorothy interrupted the crime while it was already in progress. There were signs that a struggle had taken place inside the utility closet, and Brenda and Cynthia may have been forced to their knees before their throats were cut. Investigators did confirm that all 3 women had suffered additional injuries, and while no specific details were released to the public, it was confirmed that these injuries were not of a sexual nature and no sexual assault took place. An unidentified palm print and a pair of black-rimmed wraparound sunglasses were found at the scene, though the authorities would not confirm if the print or the glasses belonged to the killer. The crime left everyone perplexed, as nothing was stolen from the salon, and all 3 victims still had cash on them when they were found. The only items that appeared to be missing were a pair of plastic beautician's capes, which would be wrapped around the customers' necks while their hair was being done. While the capes had no value, there was speculation that the killer may have used them to wipe up or conceal any blood they got on themselves. A thorough investigation was performed into the personal lives of the victims, but it failed to provide any insight into who may have had a motive to harm them, and their families and friends were described as being nothing but cooperative. Prior to the crime, Florence was described as being one of those safe small towns where everyone knew each other and nobody bothered to lock their doors. Even though local law enforcement consulted with FBI profilers about the case, they were unable to garner much insight from them, since no similar crimes like this seemed to exist in the United States at that time, and the whole situation was a complete anomaly. Ravalli County Sheriff Perry Johnson would later state, quote, "Who would have ever believed that in Florence, Montana? A daytime triple homicide with 3 unrelated people at a professional business. That's just a phenomenon." End quote. The most promising lead was the oddly dressed individual who had been seen exiting the salon prior to the discovery of the bodies. The customer who saw this individual did not report seeing him climb into a vehicle, but her story was corroborated by some other eyewitnesses who recalled seeing a person matching that description walking through the area that morning, and he was described as, quote-unquote, walking with a purpose. Police bloodhounds were brought in to pick up this person's scent, and they wound up tracking it from the grass in front of the salon through an alleyway behind the business to the parking lot of a nearby bar and restaurant called the Wild River. The bloodhounds then traveled 4 blocks and went through a pasture before the scent came to an end outside a residence on One Horse Creek Road. However, while the residence was searched, the person who lived there was described as being an elderly, housebound individual who would not have been physically capable of committing the crime, so he was cleared as a suspect. The story would soon receive nationwide attention when it was featured on an episode of America's Most Wanted, and while this helped yield a number of new tips, they failed to bring the case any closer to a resolution. For over 6 years, the crime would continue to remain unsolved, but on April 8, 2008, federal authorities announced that 2 suspects had been indicted for their roles in the murders: 31-year-old Brian Weber and 33-year-old Lincoln Benavides. Weber had grown up in Florence and was known for being a violent drug dealer who was addicted to methamphetamine and frequently committed crimes in order to support his habit. At the time of the murders, Weber was residing in Nampa, Idaho, around 375 miles away, but it was established that he had made a trip to Missoula, Montana during the first week of November of 2001. Since Missoula is only 20 miles northeast of Florence and Weber had ties to the area, he actually did pop up on the radar as a potential suspect during the first month of the investigation. After returning to Nampa, Weber was contacted by the local authorities there and agreed to be questioned about the Salon murders, and he also submitted a sample of his DNA and allowed his van to be searched. Weber would later claim that while he was being interrogated, investigators asked if there was any reason why his DNA would have been found at the hair gallery, but he told them he had not gone there since he was a child, back when the building used to be a post office. As far as I can tell, the authorities have never publicly commented about Weber's DNA possibly being at the scene, but Weber did acknowledge that he was high on meth during his interview and may have misremembered what was said. Regardless, there was no evidence to implicate Weber in the murders at that time, so he was released without charge. By November of 2003, Weber had relocated to Montana and was arrested in Missoula County on the charges of aggravated battery and aggravated assault after he attacked a man during a meth deal gone wrong. He was held in jail on a $100,000 bail, but according to the Missoula County Attorney's Office, they started receiving pressure from federal authorities to keep Weber locked up as long as possible because they were attempting to build a case against him for the Florence Salon murders. In spite of this, Weber agreed to a plea deal in May of 2004 in which he would plead guilty to the charges of felony battery and misdemeanor assault and receive a sentence of 3 years probation. Well, only 2 months later, federal authorities wound up indicting Weber on the charges of distribution of methamphetamine and conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine, and following his conviction on these charges, he received a sentence of 24 years and 3 months in federal prison. Weber's defense attorneys would later manage to get one of these convictions dismissed, so his sentence was reduced to 10 years, but while he was incarcerated, the authorities continued looking at him as a potential suspect in the Salon murders. At one point, investigators arranged for a criminal informant named Perry Willingham to share a cell with Weber at the Missoula County Detention Center, which had been bugged with listening devices. They were hoping to secretly record Weber making incriminating statements about the murders, but he apparently found out about the operation and threatened Willingham, which led to Willingham being transferred to another facility. While all this was going on, the authorities were looking at a second suspect, Lincoln Benavides, who was serving a 15-year prison sentence for selling drugs in Lake County, Montana. Like Weber, Benavides was a career criminal and suspected of being the head of a methamphetamine and marijuana distribution ring which operated in Idaho and western Montana. Investigators believe that Weber had worked as Benavides' primary distributor and enforcer and would be responsible for collecting payment from delinquent customers. The two men continued serving their respective prison sentences until they learned that a federal indictment was handed down against them in April of 2008. They were indicted on a number of different charges, including drug trafficking, conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine, distribution of methamphetamine, and violent crimes in aid of racketeering. But most importantly, they were both charged with 3 counts of murder for their alleged roles in the deaths of Dorothy Harris, Brenda Patch, and Cynthia Paulus. Very few details about the indictment were released publicly, but investigators believe that Benavides was the mastermind behind the Florence Salon Murders and sent Weber to carry them out, and the crime was supposedly related to the collection of a drug debt from one of the victims' relatives. Benavides reportedly left the country and went to Mexico shortly after the murders took place, before he resurfaced in Texas, while Weber relocated to California before he eventually returned to Montana. Weber and Benavides both pleaded not guilty to the charges, but as time went on, it became apparent that the evidence linking them to the murders was not particularly strong. In October of 2009, 18 months after the indictments were handed down, both men's defense attorneys filed a sealed motion requesting that the charges against them be dropped due to prosecutorial misconduct and serious violations of their constitutional rights. Well, shortly thereafter, Benavides wound up filing another motion to change his plea. By November, both sides had agreed to a plea deal in which Benavides would plead guilty to a pair of federal drug charges, one count of methamphetamine distribution and one count of conspiracy to distribute methamphetamine. In exchange, the murder charges against him were dropped, and he received a 25-year prison sentence. However, the murder charges against Weber remained, and the government was still planning to take him to trial in March of 2010, but it seemed apparent that the case against him was falling apart. One of their key witnesses was a woman named Emily Ross, whose testimony could supposedly provide insight into a motive for the crime, but she wound up passing away in 2008. The prosecution also decided against using another witness who was scheduled to testify against Weber after realizing that they had credibility issues. While many details about the government's case were kept secret from the public, it seemed like their evidence relied heavily on uncorroborated hearsay and testimony from unreliable sources, such as jailhouse informants. They were apparently going to allege that Weber had shown up at the hair gallery 4 days prior to the murders and made some threatening statements to one of the victims, but his defense team managed to uncover new evidence to indicate that he was actually in Moscow, Idaho on that particular date. Weber's attorneys also managed to get 2 of the federal drug charges against him dropped, as they had originally been filed in October of 2006, 2 years after Weber went to prison for his previous drug charges. But these charges weren't actually unsealed until April of 2008, and the defense argued that the statute of limitations had expired by that point. Since their case was clearly in big trouble, the U.S. Attorney's Office actually took the initiative to file a motion to drop the murder charges against Weber. They wrote, quote, "In preparation for the trial, the government has thoroughly re-evaluated the evidence upon which it will rely to prove defendant Weber committed the offenses. That review has led the government to conclude, based on the evidence as it now stands, that the government cannot prove beyond a reasonable doubt all the essential elements of those offenses." End quote. On January the 25th, 2010, a federal judge granted their motion and dropped Weber's murder charges. However, the charges were dropped without prejudice, meaning that he could be charged with the murders again should new evidence surface in the future. To this day, all court records related to the government's case against Weber and Benavides continue to remain sealed from the public. Benavides is still serving his 25-year sentence on the drug charges, but after completing his reduced 10-year sentence, Weber was released from prison and relocated to Great Falls, Montana. However, Weber kept violating his parole by getting arrested on various drug offenses, and at one point, he was charged with felony intimidation after threatening to blow up his wife's house and burn down her sister's house. Finally, in November of 2017, Weber was busted in an FBI sting operation in which a total of 8 individuals were arrested, and he was charged with possession with intent to distribute, as well as conspiracy to possess with intent to distribute controlled substances. He wound up receiving a new 15-year sentence in federal prison, which will be followed by 10 years of supervised release once his sentence comes to an end. In November of 2021, KPAX TV, a television station based out of Missoula, ran a 20th anniversary segment about the Salon Murders, which contained some interesting comments from Michael Moore, a former crime reporter for the Missoulian newspaper who had extensively covered this case. Moore addressed the original rumors, that Weber and Benavides committed the crime over a drug debt connected to one of the victim's relatives, stating, quote, "I talked to a number of people here recently that told me a story that was a bit different than that, and that it was not a relative, but that it was one of the women. And that person had run afoul of Lincoln on the end of a bunch of money which wasn't where it was supposed to be, and that Brian was then sent in to reinforce the message or something." End quote. Whatever the case, this theory has never been substantiated, and even though they are both still incarcerated for other crimes, Weber and Benavides have never officially been convicted of the Florence Salon Murders. So after 2 decades, there is still no conclusive resolution to this crime. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So I'll just state right up front that I've seen a lot of frightening composite sketches of unidentified suspects in cold cases, but the sketch of the oddly dressed individual in the Florence Salon Murders ranks right up there. If you search online, you'll find separate sketches of his face that show him wearing 2 different style hats, one of which looks like a top hat and the other a wide-brimmed fedora, and there are also 2 sketches of him wearing his long, Western-style duster coat. But perhaps the creepiest element is that one of the sketches of his face shows him smiling and displaying his teeth, and I honestly cannot recall too many other composite sketches like that. The man really looks like some sort of mythic, otherworldly figure you'd expect to find in a western set in the 19th century, and the fact that he just seemed to vanish without a trace after walking away from the murder scene only makes the situation all the more eerie. He kind of reminds me of the Creeper, a villain from the horror film Jeepers Creepers, who is an ancient demonic creature that wears a wide-brimmed hat and a black trench coat whenever it goes out in the daylight in order to disguise itself. And hell, since Jeepers Creepers was released theatrically in August of 2001, only a few months before the murders, perhaps the perpetrator saw it and used it as inspiration. Given that multiple witnesses corroborated seeing him that day, I think it's safe to say that the descriptions of his attire were accurate, and he may have intentionally dressed that way in order to disguise himself. This guy's facial features are pretty indistinct, as he looks like your average white male in his late 20s or early 30s, so perhaps his distinct clothing was an attempt to keep eyewitnesses distracted and prevent them from taking much note of what he looked like. It's worth mentioning that law enforcement has never officially named this man as a suspect, only a person of interest, but considering that the customer who saw him wound up finding the victim's bodies immediately after he exited the salon, I think it's safe to say that he was responsible for the murders of Dorothy Harris, Brenda Patch, and Cynthia Paulus. Now, I'm using the pronoun he to describe this person because most of the sources out there refer to him as male, but there has apparently been some gossip throughout the community that the individual could have been female and the hat and coat did an effective job at concealing their gender. The idea of the killer being a woman opens up a lot of interesting possibilities, since you'd assume that a woman might have been more familiar with the hair gallery and perhaps been a customer there in the past. However, law enforcement has never given off any indication that they believe the oddly dressed individual was female, so going forward, we're going to continue operating under the assumption that they were male. I guess it's only appropriate that the most likely suspect in this case has been referred to as a quote-unquote oddly dressed individual because this crime is odd in so many ways and nothing about it seems to make any sense whatsoever. There was no robbery, no sexual assault, and all 3 of the victims seemed like loving mothers and grandmothers who didn't appear to have any known enemies. Law enforcement has always been fairly divided in their opinions about the possible motive for this crime. Some of them feel it was a random thrill kill by a psychopath who had no connection to the women and just wanted to murder some strangers, while others suspect that at least one of the victims, or someone close to them, had a secret which made them target for violence. It's possible the killer only planned on murdering one of the women, while the other 2 were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. Of course, there was a time when law enforcement seemed more certain about the second theory, since 2 suspects, Brian Weber and Lincoln Benavides, were charged with these murders, and it was alleged that the crime was motivated by a drug debt that a relative of one of the victims had. But the murder charges were dropped, and since this was a federal case, and many of the documents have been sealed, we still don't know many of the specific details about why these two men were believed to be responsible for the crime and what evidence might implicate them. Regardless of their guilt or innocence, it does appear that the case against them was pretty weak and apparently based on nothing more than hearsay and testimony from unreliable eyewitnesses with credibility issues. There certainly wasn't enough evidence for the authorities to feel confident about securing a conviction, but it's also possible that Weber and Benavides were not actually responsible for these murders. I mean, they're definitely both bad guys who are going to remain locked up for the next several years for other crimes, but the fact that they're currently incarcerated makes me fear that the authorities are not feeling much urgency to explore potential alternate suspects. The situation with Benavides is particularly unique because he agreed to plead guilty to a number of drug charges in exchange for having his murder charges dropped, and I doubt the authorities would have agreed to that if they felt they could convict him on the murders. Of course, you can also take this plea deal as a sign of Benavides' guilt, but I'm sure he knew that no matter what, he was going to spend a long time in prison on the drug charges. But even though he received a 25-year sentence, there was at least a chance that Benavides could become a free man again, whereas if he was convicted of murder, this guaranteed he would remain locked up for the rest of his life. However, at the time of his plea agreement, Benavides was starting to suffer from symptoms of multiple sclerosis, and if his condition worsens, there's a chance he might not even live long enough to finish serving his sentence and walk out of prison. Weber's situation was a bit different because while he was serving time on drug charges, he was scheduled to be released within the next couple of years, so he had a lot more to lose than Benavides, and a stronger motivation to fight the murder charges. Of course, even though Weber was eventually released, it wasn't long before he reoffended and was thrown back in prison, so he's probably going to be locked up for at least another decade. The door is still open to charge Weber with the murders again should new evidence surface, so it's possible the government is keeping all the court records sealed from the public in order to protect the integrity of their case in the event of a future trial. But the alternate explanation is that these documents contain evidence of serious misconduct from federal prosecutors and investigators, which the government does not want the public seeing. You get the impression that even though the evidence against them wasn't particularly strong, the authorities were hoping that once they handed down murder indictments against Weber and Benavides, at least one of them would have cracked and made a full confession. When this didn't happen, they were forced to do a number of unethical things in a failed attempt to incriminate them. Theoretically, if federal authorities do not want this information coming to light, they could just continue to maintain that Benavides and Weber were the right guys all along, and since they're going to remain incarcerated for the foreseeable future, there's no urgency to keep working on this case. But if these two men didn't actually do it, then that means that the real perpetrator is continuing to get away with it. So in the early stages of the investigation, law enforcement reached out to the FBI to seek assistance from their criminal profilers, but they were unable to offer much insight because at the time, there did not appear to be any other known crimes in the United States which resembled the Florence Salon Murders. However, within the next few years, a pair of other crimes would be committed containing a number of similarities to this one, so I'm going to discuss them right now. The first of these crimes is known as the Dolly Madison Murders and took place in the town of Great Bend, Kansas, which is located around 1,300 miles southeast of Florence. Sometime between 5:15 and 6 p.m. on September the 4th, 2002, a customer drove into the parking lot of a Dolly Madison bakery outlet located on Harrison Street and saw a man exiting the building and pulling out a set of keys to lock the front door. When the customer approached the bakery, the man informed them that they were closed for the day, even though it was still a few hours before their scheduled closing time. Regardless, the customer still drove away from the scene, but later that evening, shortly before 8 p.m., a delivery man stopped by the bakery. Even though the front door was locked, the delivery man had a key for the rear garage door and let himself inside. When he entered the bakery, he soon discovered the bodies of two women who had been stabbed to death with a sharp object and were lying face down in pools of blood in a small office area. One of the victims was 24-year-old Mandy Alexander, a single mother of 2 daughters who worked at the bakery as a clerk. In a tragic turn of events, Mandy had been hired only 3 days earlier and was covering for another employee who was unable to work their scheduled shift that day. The second victim was 79-year-old Mary Drake, a customer who stopped by the bakery to purchase some bread. Shortly after 5 p.m., the bakery's manager had left to drop off a deposit at the bank before she went home, so Mandy was scheduled to close and had been working alone when the murders took place. Much like the Florence Salon Murders, investigators were unable to figure out a motive for this crime. Neither victim was sexually assaulted, and even though a small amount of money appeared to be missing from the cash register, the 2 victims' purses and wallets were left behind, and nothing was taken from them. Even though Mandy had gotten out of an abusive relationship with her ex-husband, he was in jail on the night the murders took place, and no evidence could be found to indicate that he may have hired someone to commit this crime. Obviously, the unidentified man that the customer had seen exiting the bakery was the prime suspect, and the keys he had taken to lock the front door were never found. He was described as being a white male in his early 30s who was about 6'1" and had light brown or blonde collar-length hair and a slight beard. He was also dressed in a faded black t-shirt, blue jean shorts, white socks, and a baseball cap. According to the owner of a motel located near the bakery, a man matching that description had checked in there on September the 4th, but when he checked out the following morning, the man had shaved his head. Even though the crimes took place in different states 1,300 miles apart, investigators did explore the possibility that the same individual may have been responsible for both the Florence Salon Murders and the Dolly Madison Murders, but no conclusive connections could be found. In September of 2022, around the 20-year anniversary of the crime, the Kansas Bureau of Investigation announced that a male DNA sample had been found on one of the victims, but while the sample wasn't large enough to be entered into a national database of criminal offenders, it could still be compared to the DNA of any potential suspects who popped up on the radar. Earlier this year, a 52-minute documentary about the case was released titled The Dolly Madison Murders. It was directed by Aaron Mull, a filmmaker who hails from Great Bend, and the film is currently available for streaming on Tubi. Watching the documentary, it's clear that the victims' families are very unhappy with the investigation and believe that law enforcement is dragging their feet in order to cover up their own incompetence. The implication seems to be that the authorities know who did it, but because they completely botched the handling of the crime scene and contaminated a lot of physical evidence, they are unable to build a proper case against the perpetrator and make an arrest. Indeed, given the violent nature of this crime, it does seem odd that investigators were only able to recover a partial male DNA profile and waited 2 decades to make an announcement about this. The documentary also makes no mention at all of the Florence Salon Murders, so in spite of the similarities between the 2 crimes, I get the impression that the idea of the same perpetrator being responsible has all but been ruled out. So the second case I want to discuss took place in Belleville, Illinois, on March the 2nd, 2005, and even though Belleville is located over 1,600 miles southeast of Florence, the similarities between these 2 crimes are pretty eerie. This was another triple murder which took place in a beauty salon, and the 3 victims were the salon's 62-year-old owner, Michael Cooney, who was stabbed 25 times, and 82-year-old Dorothy Bone and 79-year-old Doris Fisher, a pair of sisters who were regular customers there and had been stabbed 10 times each. Much like the Florence Salon Murders, the victims' bodies were discovered by a customer who was arriving there for an 11 a.m. appointment. Dorothy's body was lying in the hallway, and Michael and Doris were found dead in a back room where he had been washing her hair. Once again, it did not appear that robbery was the motive, as nothing was stolen from the scene except Michael's car, which was likely used as the getaway vehicle and later found abandoned in St. Louis. I'm not going to delve too deeply into this case as it's a major rabbit hole, and I could probably devote an entire podcast episode to the story. But long story short, a suspect named Darrell Lane, who was only 16 years old at the time of the crime and had an IQ of 63, would be charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and went on trial in November of 2010, but the jury found him not guilty on all charges. In September of 2016, another suspect, 51-year-old Samuel Johnson, was charged with all three murders, but even though he had a personal connection to Michael Cooney and the evidence against him appeared to be overwhelming, the state would not get their opportunity to convict him. While Johnson's trial was scheduled to take place in May of 2020, the COVID-19 pandemic caused it to be postponed indefinitely, and in February of 2021, Johnson wound up passing away due to complications from COVID. I have to admit that when I first learned about the Belleville Salon Murders, it sounded so similar to the Florence Murders that I felt there had to be a connection, but it seems like the authorities have eliminated this possibility. Even though he was never officially found guilty in a court of law, Samuel Johnson does seem to be the most likely perpetrator. What's particularly important is that both Johnson and Darrell Lane, the other defendant who went on trial for this crime, were black, and obviously do not match the description of the oddly dressed white male seen exiting the hair gallery in Florence. Now, getting back to the Dolly Madison murders, it is odd that we have another crime in which multiple people were brutally murdered inside a public place during business hours, and in both cases, a customer just happened to see the likely perpetrator exiting the establishment. I'm sure it must have been a terrifying feeling for both of these eyewitnesses to know that if they had shown up just a few minutes earlier, they may have been killed as well. It's also interesting how both these crimes took place after the establishment's manager dropped off a deposit at the bank, meaning there wouldn't have been much cash on the premises if robbery was the motive. I have to admit that when I first learned about the Dolly Madison murders, I started wondering if the perpetrator was some sort of spree killer like the unidentified I-70 killer from the 1990s, who showed up at random businesses in different states and murdered at least 6 victims whom he likely had no connection to. This could account for why these separate crimes took place 1,300 miles apart in Montana and Kansas, but the thing that separates these cases from the I-70 killer is that he used a gun, while the victims in Florence and Great Bend either had their throats cut or were stabbed to death. It's far less effort to pull a trigger and fire bullets into people rather than attack them with a sharp object and potentially get a lot of blood on yourself and leave a bunch of physical evidence behind. So there may have been something a lot more personal involved with both the Florence Salon and Dolly Madison murders. I may do a separate episode about the Dolly Madison murders on The Trail Went Cold in the future, because it's a very intriguing case in its own right, but unless I hear about additional evidence that suggests otherwise, I'm going to assume that these two crimes are not actually connected. I get the impression that whoever committed the murders in Great Bend may have been a local with some knowledge of the area and the bakery. And as far as I know, Brian Weber and Lincoln Benavides, the two biggest suspects in the Florence murders, did not have any ties to Great Bend. But while we're on the subject of Weber and Benavides, let's discuss their possible resemblance, or lack thereof, to the composite sketches of the oddly dressed individual seen exiting the hair gallery. Granted, the only photographs I've seen of the two men are mugshots which were taken a few years after the fact, but I can safely say that the guy from the sketch looks nothing like Benavides. However, the scenario pushed forward by the government was that Benavides sent Weber to carry out the murders on his behalf and was not personally present at the scene. On the surface, Weber does not have much of a resemblance to the sketch either, but the suspect's facial features are pretty indistinct, and he looks like your standard white male. Weber would have been 25 years old when the crime took place, so he fits the age range, but he has a goatee in his mugshots from a few years later, and I have no idea if Weber was clean-shaven in November of 2001. Now, we know that Weber grew up in Florence, and even though he was living in Idaho at the time, he supposedly traveled to Missoula, which is just outside Florence, on the same week the crime took place. If Weber had gone on trial, the government was apparently going to allege that he had been seen at the hair gallery on November the 2nd, 4 days prior to the murders, making threats against one of the victims, but the defense claimed that they had uncovered evidence that placed Weber hundreds of miles away in Idaho on that particular date. Since this was not the same date when the murders occurred, that would not entirely prove Weber's innocence, but it certainly appeared to open up holes in the government's case and influence their decision to file a motion to have the murder charges dropped against him. Again, we don't know the full details of the government's case, only that it relied heavily on testimony from witnesses who were believed to be unreliable or had serious credibility issues. It's been reported that the prosecution suffered a major setback when a witness named Emily Ross passed away, but even though she supposedly could have provided some insight into the motive for this crime, it's never been revealed who this woman was, how she fit into the case, or how valuable her testimony would have been. I know Weber claims that in the weeks following the crime, he was interrogated by law enforcement and recalls them asking him why his DNA was found at the murder scene. But even if Weber's recollection is accurate, I have a feeling this may have been some sort of bluff intended to scare him into making a confession. If any DNA or physical evidence linking Weber to the crime had been found at the scene, I seriously doubt that the murder charges would have been dropped. But let's look at the circumstances of how this crime was carried out. No matter who the perpetrator was or what their motive could have been, committing the murders under these circumstances was incredibly risky. Even though the hair gallery was a standalone building, it was located next to a highway, and since the building had once been a post office, there were a lot of windows on it, so the interior was visible to passing motorists. There's also the fact that the salon was open for business at the time of the murders, and anyone could have walked in there at any moment, so it was incredibly brazen for the perpetrator to show up and kill 3 people in broad daylight. What's also strange is that this person did not arrive in a vehicle and left the scene on foot, though it's possible they could have parked their vehicle at another spot a few blocks away and used it to drive out of the area. If that was their plan, then it worked out for them, because if they had parked directly outside the salon, then the customer who arrived would have seen it and possibly gotten the license number. Since all 3 women had their throats cut, it's reasonable to assume that the killer would have gotten blood on themselves, but I don't believe the customer or any of the other witnesses who saw him reported seeing any blood. But this may have been the reasoning behind his decision to wear the long black duster coat. If the killer wasn't wearing it when they committed the murders, they may have decided to put it on afterward in order to conceal any blood they got on their clothing. A pair of beautician's capes were also discovered to be missing from the salon, and I think it's possible they may have been used to clean up or conceal blood evidence. One detail which has never made much sense to me are the pair of sunglasses which were described as being found right in the middle of the crime scene. It's never been conclusively established that they belonged to the killer, but while I could see him wearing the glasses in order to disguise himself, it's odd that he would then leave them behind. What we know about the timeline is that Dorothy made a deposit at the bank about a half hour before the bodies were discovered, so she was likely murdered immediately after she returned to the salon. Since Brenda and Cynthia were found in a utility closet, it's possible that they were both already dead by the time Dorothy arrived, or she walked in while the crime was in progress. We still don't know if this was a random crime, or if any of the 3 victims were specifically targeted, but for now, let's operate under the assumption that one of them was. Cynthia seems to be the least likely candidate to have been targeted, since she usually came in for appointments at the hair gallery on Friday mornings, but decided to reschedule her appointment for Tuesday morning that week. So unless the killer had been following Cynthia from her residence, how could they know that she would be at the salon on that particular morning? Since Dorothy and Brenda were employees, they definitely seem like better candidates to be a target, since the killer may have known they'd be working there. If the perpetrator was targeting Dorothy, she may not have been back yet when he first arrived, but he still had to kill Brenda and Cynthia because they were witnesses, and then proceeded to conceal their bodies in the utility closet and wait around until Dorothy returned. The positioning of Dorothy's body by the doorway might indicate that she was ambushed right after she walked inside. Following the arrests of Weber and Benavides, the theory presented was that a relative of one of the victims had an issue with them, possibly related to a drug debt, so Weber was dispatched to the hair gallery to send some sort of message. And even if the 2 men only had an issue with a relative of one of the women, the other 2 still wound up being murdered because they happened to be at the salon. Given the secretive nature of the government's case, I have no idea if they had any real evidence that a relative of one of the victims was involved in drugs, or if this was just a theory they dreamed up because they were desperate to pin the crime on Weber and Benavides. However, we have those cryptic comments which were made a year and a half ago by former reporter Michael Moore, who said he had recently spoken to people who shared information to indicate that one of the 3 women had issues with Benavides, which paved the way for the murders. But since Moore didn't reveal any specific details, I have no idea which woman he was referring to or why he thinks they were involved in something shady. Well, I have to say that Moore's statements took me by complete surprise, because I read a lot of the original news coverage which took place following the murders, and featured a number of interviews with the victims' friends and relatives, and I never saw anything to indicate that Dorothy, Brenda, or Cynthia might have a dark secret. They were all portrayed as loving wives, mothers, and grandmothers who seemed to have stable family lives, and at one point, I saw Dorothy get described with the true crime world's most cliched phrase, quote, "She was the type of person who lit up a room." If any of these women had enemies who would have had a motive to commit murder, it doesn't sound like the authorities uncovered any leads pointing in that direction during the early stages of the investigation. It was also reported that the victims' families were very cooperative with law enforcement, and if any of them raised red flags to suggest complicity in the murders, or that they knew more about the crime than they were letting on, investigators never said so publicly. It was not until Weber and Benavides were indicted years later that we started hearing about one of the women's relatives possibly having a drug debt, and the reason that scenario didn't sound overly implausible is that some of them had pretty sizable families. In particular, Dorothy and Cynthia had a ton of children, stepchildren, and grandchildren between them, so if one of them was involved in something illegal, I could see that flying underneath the radar. But did one of these women actually become involved with a dangerous drug dealer like Lincoln Benavides? Hypothetically, if one of them did, I find it more likely that it would be Dorothy or Brenda, since, once again, they worked at the salon, and Cynthia would not have ordinarily been there on a Tuesday morning. I'm certainly not going to point any fingers at Brenda, as I've never heard anything bad about her, but Dorothy had a reputation for being a kindly grandmother figure who did not seem like a candidate to be associated with a drug dealer. But then again, a salon is the type of business which could be used as a front for drug activity, and Dorothy was the owner. I have to harken back to the phrasing that Michael Moore used when discussing one of the women's possible involvement with Benavides, as he stated, quote-unquote, "That person had run afoul of Lincoln on the end of a bunch of money which wasn't where it was supposed to be. Who knows? Perhaps the targeted victim did not knowingly do anything illegal, but got themselves into a situation where they saw or heard something they weren't supposed to. Perhaps nothing was stolen from the cash register or the victim's purses, because the killer believed there was some other money stashed on the premises somewhere for them to collect." However, I want to stop short at pushing this theory too hard and accusing some potentially innocent murder victims of being involved in drug dealing. While it sounds like there are still rumors floating around that Benavides sent Weber to the hair gallery to commit murder and send some sort of message over a drug debt, there really doesn't appear to be much in the way of hard evidence to prove this theory other than unreliable hearsay and gossip. Otherwise, this case probably would have gone to trial a long time ago. Also, while I might be asking too much to expect logic and rational planning from a pair of meth addicts, if they really wanted to target someone at the salon, it doesn't make much sense to do so in broad daylight during the early morning hours when customers are going to be wandering in and out of the establishment. Why not wait until around closing time when there's less chance of trouble? And while we're on the subject of Weber being a meth addict, would someone like him really be capable of committing 3 murders like this without leaving any real evidence behind? I have no idea how much DNA or fingerprint evidence there might be, and while investigators made mention of an unidentified palm print, they did not reveal where it was found or state with any certainty that it belonged to the killer. Of course, one issue is that since this was a public business, there is bound to be a lot of DNA and fingerprints found at the scene, making it difficult to discern which physical evidence belongs to the killer and which belongs to customers who frequented the business on a previous occasion. But I'd be willing to wager that none of the DNA, fingerprints, or palm prints from the salon matched Weber, because otherwise, the murder charges against him wouldn't have been dropped. Without knowing the full nature of the government's case against Weber and Benavides, I guess I can't completely rule out their involvement. And even if they weren't the actual perpetrators, The fact that rumors continue to swirl about the crime being drug-related means that it very well could have been the motive for these murders. But man, the sheer randomness of this crime still makes me wonder if it was committed by someone who just felt the urge to kill some people and decided to pick out the hair gallery. It could have been an individual with no ties to the area who parked their car a few blocks from the salon, walked there well clad in a hat and duster coat to disguise themselves, killed everyone who was inside the building, and then walked back to their car to drive out of the area forever. If they were just passing through Florence and never returned, then that would make this case all the more difficult to solve. Hell, in online discussions about this case, I've seen none other than Israel Keyes push forward as a potential suspect. Yes, I know online sleuths have tried to pin every unsolved American cold case from the 2000s on him, but he was honorably discharged from the Army only 4 months before these murders, and was living nearly 700 miles west in Washington state at that time. Of course, I see zero indication that Keyes was investigated by the authorities as a potential suspect, but even if it wasn't him, the perpetrator could have been another Keyes-like figure who decided to target some people at random, and Dorothy, Brenda, and Cynthia all just had the misfortune of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. If it was Weber and Benavides, then at least they're going to remain locked up for the next little while, even though they have never been formally convicted of these murders. But if it wasn't them, I really hope the authorities are not going to be content for them to be the fall guys and pin the crime on the two men without conclusive evidence. Dorothy Harris, Brenda Patch, and Cynthia Paulus left behind a lot of loved ones who want conclusive answers about what happened, and they definitely deserve justice. So if you happen to have any information about the Florence Salon Murders, please contact the Ravalli County Sheriff's Office at 406-375-4060. That's 406-375-4060. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. This past month, I released an episode about the 1910 disappearance of Conradina Olson, which was featured on Unsolved Mysteries, and explored the possibility that she was a Jane Doe who was allegedly murdered next to some railroad tracks and buried in an unmarked grave. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss yet another case from Unsolved Mysteries, the 1967 murder of Ralph Probst. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Paul R., John M., and Christopher D. Thank you all so much for your support. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold will be appearing at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place from August the 25th to the 27th at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel in Austin, Texas. We've got a specialized promo code which you can use to get a 15% discount on tickets to the event, so if you would like to purchase tickets, please visit their website at truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use our promo code TRAIL. Once again, that's truecrimepodcastfestival.com, and the promo code is TRAIL. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.